Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. I appreciate you all making time for this. My name is Kelly Bonomo. I'm the Business Development Director for eImagine, and we are an Indianapolis-based IT consulting company focused mainly on Microsoft and Salesforce. We've been in the Indianapolis community for more than 20 years now. And again, my name is Kelly Bonomo. I'm the Business Development Director with eImagine. I am focused mainly on commercial clients, but also work with a little bit of government as well. I live in Fishers, and I have 2 young boys who are very busy in soccer and baseball right now. Now I'll pass the mic over to Brittany.
There, sorry, it took a few clicks for the unmute to happen. Sorry about that. My name is Brittany Earwood. I've been with eImagine for about 6 years, working mostly as a project manager, sometimes as a business analyst. In addition to project management, I'm recently a part of our client solutions team, whose focus is really to collaborate with our customers to develop solutions that work for them. Outside of work, I have 5 children in my house. You didn't hear me wrong. I do have 5 children. We're massive Disney fans, and I actually just got back from my honeymoon in Disney. It was very fun. So like Kelly said, we'd like to welcome everybody to How to Be a Badass Brainstormer. Before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about Project Rescue. We found in kind of working on projects and working with folks that about 74% of all projects end up in a place of failure in some fashion. And at eImagine, we really pride ourselves and have a lot of experience with taking some of those projects and really working through them to find great success at the end of those. We have a project rescue guide that has some tips and tricks on how to turn those trouble projects around and find success and really kind of rescue those projects. We'll give you guys that link at the end of this, but we did want to mention that just a little bit. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about affinity diagramming. It's been around for a long time, but I personally came across it like 4 years ago and started adopting it into projects not long after in various fashions. This is also a technique that we've adopted as a company, and we even provide this as a one-off service for groups that need either a little bit of extra help in getting through an issue, or they're looking to generate some deep thought in an issue. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing that we should be asking ourselves is, what is an affinity diagram, right? So it's also called space, saturate, and group. That name is very literal. You're saturating the space and then you're grouping it. So it's a tool that's used to organize large ideas into groups based on their natural relationships. And it looks a little bit like something like what you're seeing on the screen here. So you'll kind of see step 1 here at the top, and we'll go into this in detail towards the end. And then you'll kind of see 2 in the bottom. Typically, affinity diagramming is something that you're going to see in the UX and design sectors, but this is something that we've kind of adopted to work in all facets of project management. Something that you might be asking yourself is why, right? So why would I use affinity diagramming? Is it better than another technique? Is it more important than another technique? And the simplest answer that I have to that is absolutely not. And in fact, I don't believe that any technique is better than another by itself. Rather, some techniques are more useful in specific situations, depending on the context, and depending on some of the other factors that you have going on. So why, right? So we still haven't really answered that question. How is affinity diagramming more useful? In what context is affinity diagramming more useful? And I'd like to get there by telling you guys a quick story. I really like to tell stories. If you knew me, and I hope that you guys get to know me a little bit in the amount of time that we have today, you'll know that I like to live my life through stories. I like to learn through story. I think that that's a really great way to obtain information and just kind of learn as a person. So a few years ago, I was on a project And this project didn't have a big budget for requirements, but what it did have was a really big stakeholder group. That stakeholder group had a lot of wants and a lot of needs. And something that I found is that when there's a lot of stakeholders in the mix, teams can kind of get stuck in the small stuff, right? The stuff that they care about in their silo, and they kind of lose sight of the big picture. That's a really common problem when you have big stakeholder groups. And something that's really important to me when I'm working on projects is getting our clients and our teams to really develop that big picture, to get on the same page about the big picture, and then getting a team consensus on what we're working towards. So like, what's important, where are we trying to go, what is it that we're trying to achieve in this project and as a team. And we needed those answers, and we needed them efficiently. And so I kind of puzzled over this for a while, and I thought to myself, like, how do we allow the stakeholders to feel heard? How do we get our sponsors to feel like they're taking care of their budget, right? Because we want to make sure that those folks feel like they're being taken care of as well. And then, you know, ultimately, how do we get everybody driving towards the big picture? And then how do we do that quickly, right? And then I remember that there's this tool that I had learned about. It's supposed to be helpful for getting groups to come to a consensus. It's good for working through and synthesizing a lot of information. And it was a big project, and we had a lot of requirements and user stories that we needed to puzzle through. And then most importantly, it's simple, right? It's a very simple exercise and simple activity. And if you remember the picture that was on the title slide, hopefully some of you got to see it, of the little scientist. I'm all about experimentation. eImagine as a company is all about experimentation. We're all about failing fast, right? And so I thought, well, let's just try it, right? This thing I found out about, let's see if it works. And if it does, awesome. And if it doesn't, you know, we've lost like a day or two, and then we can go back to the drawing board and figure out what is going to work next. So we did that. And Affinity Diagramming, what it does is it creates a wall of information that allows teams to go quickly from analysis to synthesis, right? So they have all this information, and we need to synthesize it quickly. Its strengths really lie in the fact that it's simple. It supports innovation. Because it's a brainstorming technique, folks really are able to innovate with this and think big ideas. It helps groups come to a consensus about important issues, and it helps teams see the big picture in both a metaphorical and a literal sense. This is a very physical exercise, so they literally see the big picture when they're done. Where I would say it's probably not the best technique contextually, right? So if you have a group that doesn't have a good facilitator or doesn't have a good moderator, we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that you should be looking for when you're looking for a good moderator or a good facilitator. You probably don't want to do this because it's a really active brainstorming technique, and because you're working with groups of people trying to kind of suss out that information. You really want to have good and active facilitation. It's also a really physical activity. So if your team isn't really jazzed about the idea of like literally getting up and putting stuff on a board, or literally getting up and walking around with each other, this isn't going to be a thing that your team's probably going to be good at. And I'll say I've tried to do this with groups that just weren't super active people, and it failed miserably, and that was okay. We wanted to try it. We agreed to try it as a group, and it didn't go well. And right about halfway through the meeting, we were like, okay, well, forget it. Let's just try something else that works, because we're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And then the other thing where I would say contextually it's probably not a good idea is these are temporary, right? So they're intended to be a brainstorming exercise so you can get all that information up there and talk about it and have some great insights. Not meant to be a permanent fixture. So you need to be able to get that information down and into something if you want to do something with it later. So we talked a little bit about the why. We're going to talk a little bit about the how now, right? So we talked about the what, talked about the why. We're going to talk about the how. How do you do affinity diagramming? This is very easy. There are two parts to it. So the first part, and I apologize if my face is in the way. Let's try that. Let's try that. So the first part is just generating that sticky note, right? So what you're going to do is you're really just going to have the team start writing down facts or ideas and then just get them on the wall, like as quickly as possible, as many ideas as they possibly can. This is an area where good facilitation is important, right? Because you want somebody who's able to kind of pick at people's brains and get those ideas flowing. This is also where you could, and we have, be using affinity diagramming to generate user stories. So we've had, eImagine has a thing called Agile Games, where we host various learning exercises on different things around the Agile world. And one of the learning exercises that we've done is around this, around learning how to use this tool in order to generate user stories. And in the past, what we've used is an example where you're building a theme park. And so it would be during this phase, you'd be putting stories up like, as a mom, I want to make sure my kids' buckle works so that they can ride the ride safely. Or as an investor, I want a 15% ROI, and I don't know if that's a good ROI or not, but I want a 15% ROI so that my investment can be profitable. Or as a safety inspector, I want to make sure that the rides are being regularly cleaned so that we don't get fined by the state. So you would be kind of generating those user stories haphazardly. Everybody should have kind of their own stack of Post-it notes, their own pen, and they're just kind of putting those ideas up at the board. So the facilitator would kind of be, you know, maybe postulating things out loud in order to get the ideas flowing. Encourage your team. Remind them that there's no dumb ideas, there's no bad ideas. This is really the time that we're working together to generate as many things as we can on the board. If you'll remember a few slides back, we talked about saturate space and group, right? So we're really trying to get everybody to saturate the board. You'll see in my picture here, we want it to kind of look messy like that, right? We just want as many things as we can on the board. Using that user story example, I've seen this. I mean, I think we've done like a dozen learning exercises or something like that. And every time, about 20 minutes into it, those ideas really just start flowing. Like you don't have a problem anymore once people get that ideas going. You just have to kind of like get that engine going and get people going, and then they'll be good to go. I'll move myself over there so I can find my arrow. And then the next part two, there's only two parts. Part one, space saturate. Part two, group. This is where we start organizing those ideas into their general group. So your team is going to start moving like ideas into groups, kind of based on those natural relationships. And that'll kind of happen naturally, right? So if we're building on that amusement park user story idea, this is where we would kind of start identifying those things into feature sets or epics, right? So maybe things like safety, right? So the user story about the mom and wanting the belt buckles to latch, and the story about the safety inspector, those would kind of naturally fall into a feature or an epic called safety. And then maybe the investor user story would naturally fall into one called profit or revenue or money or something like that, right? But that'll kind of happen naturally. Typically, this step is supposed to be silent. Like if you look at articles and blogs and other stuff of groups who do affinity diagramming, this is supposed to be technically a silent exercise. I think it's because it makes it go faster. In the past, I've found that group discussion makes this process go longer, but I've absolutely had groups that want to talk about their stories and their ideas before they kind of group them around. I am not one to say that collaboration isn't good, or to tell my team that they can't work together if that's going to be a thing that makes them most efficient and most collaborative and gets us to point A, or gets us from point A to point B better and faster. So if it means that the process takes a little bit longer, I'm all for having my teams continue to talk about it out loud. I just kind of bucket that time based on if I know them or not. If I don't know them, I'll just try to move a little bit faster. The group should really just kind of continue moving through until all of the ideas have been grouped. If there's disagreement, and sometimes there absolutely will be disagreement on where a user story or where an idea should be grouped, and that's okay. I would say step one, try to get your team to come to a consensus on which idea that it should go into. Try to get them to decide. If they really can't decide and they're just stuck on it, you've got two people who are like, absolutely not, it goes in these two things, just split it. Like, just, you know, try to make it as easy as possible, get another Post-it note, write the exact same thing and just split it across the different groups. You can either figure it out later or, you know, maybe they just stay in separate groups because they really were genuinely two different ideas. And that's it. That's it. I told you, affinity diagramming really lies in its simplicity. It's step one, get those ideas on the board. Step two, group them out. But I think what's important to take away, and we'll go through some tips here in just a second, is that this is a really, really, really cool tool for getting a lot of information synthesized into a good space really quickly. Another example, another story that I can tell is that we had a project where we had already kind of developed the user stories and the requirements and what we needed to do, was just figure out what was the most important stuff, right? What was the stuff that they wanted to care about? We're going to talk about it a little bit, but there's a part two to this. There's an evolution of affinity diagramming into affinity estimation, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But we went through over 200 requirements or 200 user stories, and in less than 2 hours, we had those organized basically by sprint for the entirety of the project. And for anybody who's on this call who's been a part of a project or who has been a project manager, you know that that process often takes a lot longer because there's many stakeholders and everybody has something to say. So I found it to be just really kind of mind-blowing that we were able to get through that so quickly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips for you, and I'm going to go through those a little bit quickly because I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure if there's time for questions and stuff. So I'm going to move this down to the bottom so I can see and you can see. So the first one is make sure you appoint a moderator or a facilitator. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about you know, where its strengths lie and where its strengths don't lie. Really make sure you get a single person appointed who's going to moderate this. You want to keep your group small, so 6 people or less should be in the room. I think we've gone up to 10 people, and when we did that, it took exponentially longer to go through the process, which was fine because that group also wanted to talk through things, but you just kind of want to make sure you keep those groups small. You also want to make sure that in those groups, you involve different stakeholder groups. So you don't want all developers or all business analysts or all salespeople. You kind of want a little bit from everybody. And really the explanation for that is very simple. You just want a lot of different ideas and you want a lot of different viewpoints in order to kind of see the big picture and kind of get that melting pot of ideas going. The other thing that you're going to do is photograph the map. So when you're done with it and kind of once it's all on the wall and everything, just take a real quick picture of it, put it somewhere, and then you can use that to generate future discussions or really decide what it is that you're going to do with your diagramming map when you're done. A couple of tips about skill sets that your moderator should have. They should have good listening skills. And I don't just mean, yes, I heard the thing that you said, listening skills. I'm talking about that really deep, soft skill listening skills where they can kind of hear the room or hear between the lines and really understand what it is that people are saying so that they can kind of suss that out. You also want somebody to have enthusiasm, right? So if you've got somebody that's kind of like, oh, I just want to be here and just you guys do whatever, that's not going to be very fun, and people aren't going to be excited. They're not going to feel engaged, right? So you want to have somebody who's got kind of a bubbly personality, who's got some enthusiasm, who's excited to be there, who's excited to be a part of the process. You also want somebody who has good people management skills. And what I mean by that is somebody who can kind of work the room, right? So if you've got a group of people and you're trying to suss out those ideas and you're trying to get their brain engine going and you're trying to get their creative juices going, you want somebody who's got the people skills necessary to do that, right? So they're gonna talk to people and they're gonna have ideas themselves and they're gonna kind of poke at the people who are being quiet. You want somebody who has authority. So you want somebody who has been, who has that kind of like stance, right? They can control the room, and they can kind of keep people on task and keep people engaged in the things they're working on. And then the other thing, I feel like our disc profile for our moderator is a little bit all over the place right now, but the other thing is that you want somebody who has patience and persistence. So it's hard. Brainstorming is hard. It's really hard, especially for like super logical type A people, to get creative juices flowing, to get into that mindset where they're thinking outside the box, or they're throwing out ideas, or they feel safe enough to throw out dumb ideas, right? It's a very vulnerable thing. Sometimes brainstorming, it can be very scary to toss out ideas that you don't know if people are going to think you're an idiot for. So you want your moderator to have kind of that patience and that persistence to help them push past that barrier, because you can't push them past it. But what you can do is you can kind of sit with them, kind of patiently draw them across that line so they can really start getting the most out of it. You also want to provide your Affinity team with data and background. I would highly discourage anybody from just dumping people into an Affinity diagramming session without them knowing what they're supposed to do for a variety of reasons. But so before your Affinity diagramming session, like long before, let them know that it's coming before it's ever even been scheduled. Say, hey, we're going to have an Affinity diagramming session, and it's going to be about this thing, and this is what Affinity diagramming means, and here's what we're going to do, and here's our output that we think that we're going to get, right? So you're answering that big, why are we here question, and then keep feeding them that all the way until you get into the Affinity diagramming session, and then kick off the Affinity diagramming session by reminding them. There's a few reasons for that. One, if you set the expectations and meet the expectations, all of that other head trash, all of that other head clutter, those things that stop you from good brainstorming, those are gone, because they're not asking why we're here. They're not asking what's this for. They're not asking how are we going to do it. They're not asking what's the purpose. You've already answered those things, right? So now their brain doesn't have all of those barriers, and it can get way more quickly from where they are now to really juicy brainstorming much faster. So really, really, really provide them with the data and the background, and really kind of prime that before you ever even go. Find a space with a large wall or a large whiteboard, but stands to reason, hopefully, because you're going to get a lot of ideas. Hopefully you get a lot of ideas, but if they're in a small room with a small space, they're going to limit themselves because they're going to think that they don't have space to put the ideas on the wall. So you give them more information, more wall, more space, their ideas are going to be much bigger, because they're not going to be thinking, oh, but I've only got this 5-foot space, and if I put any more Post-it notes, there's not going to be space for it. So make sure you give your team a lot of space, large walls, big whiteboard, something that they can work with. And the last tip that I have for you guys is make sure you give the team ample time. And I don't mean an hour. I don't even mean 2 hours. I mean like a half a day. And just something that I found in my experience is it takes a good 10 minutes, 20 minutes, probably just to kick things off, right? You need to explain why you're there. People are going to want to chat. They're going to want to settle in. You have to pass out Post-it notes and markers and explain where things are going to go. And then there's the time spent just getting the creative engine going, right? There's the time where you're spending just getting the wheels going, just getting the ideas going, and that takes time. That's where the patience comes in, right? So that's a thing that, like, a minimum of 20 minutes to 30 minutes is what I would say to get to like what your real start point is, right? It's like, just because people are writing on a Post-it note doesn't mean you started. I would say wait until like 30 minutes after that, and then start getting people going, because it just takes a long time for people's creative juices to start going. And then after that, there's the time for getting the ideas on the board. And then after that, there's the time of grouping those ideas. And again, depending on whether or not you have a group that wants to talk through everything or not, really depends on how long that period of time needs to be. And that's kind of something that you need to know before you schedule it, because you don't want to rush people. And you also don't want to do like stop in the middle, part 2 tomorrow. So when I say give the team ample time, it's not uncommon for an entire day to be reserved just for the Affinity diagramming. Like, part 1 is the first half of the day, break for lunch, part 2 is the second half of the day. So that's a long process. Hopefully I see 16 chats, so I hope that people have been asking questions as we go along. So I'd like to stop for questions, and I'm going to get my chat up here because Nolan is going to send them to me because I don't know if we have time to go through all of the questions. 2 minutes, I'm so sorry. I don't know if we have time to go through all of the questions, so I will get with Nolan. So I think the first question is, what options or recommendations do you have for a team to utilize affinity diagramming while working virtually? That is a really good question. So Peter Lacey says it's best to be face-to-face. Someone mentioned Miro, a product to give virtual space. I totally agree with Peter, or I hope it's Peter. I totally agree. It's absolutely best to be face-to-face. We're living in a time where absolute best is kind of our dream, and the next is what we can get creative with. So here's what I'll say, and I think you'll find the same feedback when it comes to retrospectives, right? So you want to create a space that's as in person as you possibly can. So if you can get on a video chat, awesome. I would recommend, if you can't see people, if you can't get on a video chat to do this, if you can't kind of see people's faces at some point, not sure I would totally recommend this technique for this time. I would find something that's a little bit more conducive to not being face-to-face. Microsoft Teams has a really cool feature now called Together Mode, where if you click that button, then everybody magically appears in like a room together. But if you can't do that, I think Peter mentioned Miro. There's a Trello is another option that we've used if you want just a free option. It's not the greatest, but we've done it with some success. Teams also has Whiteboard. There's a lot of different options. I would recommend getting creative, but I would also highly recommend prioritizing getting people's faces so that you can actually see them. I just think that that's an important part of getting those creative juices going. We're human beings, and that's a thing that we really rely on. So Nolan, I don't know if there were any other questions. I don't see any other questions. No more questions. Okay, well, that was a good question. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to drop them. Otherwise, I would just say, oh, okay. Somebody says, at what point in system development projects do you think affinity diagramming would be most effective? So I'll answer that first question before I read the second question. In the planning and discovery phase is where I think it would be most effective. And I say that because that's kind of the point of the project when you're generating ideas, when you're trying to develop that big picture and get everybody moving. Later in the project, I would say affinity diagramming works really well if you're at a sprint where you've got some design thinking going on. So I would say, let's say you're in a later sprint and you haven't quite come up with a design or an architecture for a piece of functionality that you're moving through. I think affinity diagramming would be a great place for that too. The second question is, what happens if there are many processes followed by different users? Having 6 people in session is not enough to get a full picture of the system usability. Yeah, that's another good question. I would just add people, but add time. If you need to have that many people, what I would suggest is try to keep it to like a stakeholder representative for each group. So if you've got 10 different groups, I would just have 10 people in the session. And if you've got more than that, maybe split it into multiple affinity diagramming sessions and then kind of join those at the end. I don't know if I would necessarily do more than 10 people because I think it just gets cluttered. But maybe try to have representatives from those sessions or split it into multiples if you're able to split it into multiples. Those are great questions. So I want to say thank you all for attending. This afternoon, you guys are going to receive a short survey asking how you enjoyed today's webinar. Please say you enjoyed it. Plus, be on the lookout for more webinars in the future. I'd like to thank our sponsor, AFIT Staffing, for making today possible. Thank you, AFIT. I was very excited to be here. Hopefully my nerves did not show, and I want to say thank you. So there's a couple more things. You can download our Affinity Diagramming one-pager at beimagine.com/projectrescue, or you can email us at projectrescue@beimagine.com. And then we do have one more webinar covering the evolution of affinity diagramming. So the next kind of step of that is affinity estimation. So that's where we kind of take all those user stories and we create a matrix of value and effort in order to help teams kind of decide what it is that they want to prioritize when they're building out their sprints and building out their work. So again, I want to say thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully you learned a little bit. Hopefully you learned a lot. And if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to us and ask us.